The scent of lilies from my wife's funeral was still in the air when my son-in-law, Julian, burst into the house with his friends. He didn't say a word, just walked straight to me, who was sitting dumbfounded in my armchair. He held out his hand. "Give me the keys, Art." I looked up at him, then at the stranger standing in my living room. "This is my house, Julian." He let out a cruel, echoing laugh. "Your house?" He leaned in close, his voice snarling. "Give me the keys or we'll get them ourselves. You're just a guest here, old man." Instead of getting angry, I smiled. I stood up, went into the study, and came back with an envelope. "You're right," I said, handing it to him. "The real owner should keep it. Read page 5. And that's when their smug faces paled. My son-in-law thought he could barge into my home with his friends, but my dead wife still owns it. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe, even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? An architect of both buildings and a life meticulously crafted, Arthur now found himself in the hollowed-out shell of his own creation. The last of the funeral guests had departed, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than the thickest of concrete walls. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had once been a comforting metronome to his and Eleanor's shared existence, now hammered home the brutal reality of his solitude. He sat in his worn leather armchair, a silent sentinel watching the Pacific swallow the last vestiges of the afternoon sun. A silk scarf of Eleanor's clutched in his hand. It was a vibrant turquoise, a stark contrast to the gray landscape of his grief, and it carried her scent, a faint, floral ghost that was both a comfort and a cruel reminder of all he had lost. Lily, their daughter, was a crumpled heap on the sofa, her quiet sobs the only sound in the vast, echoing space. Her grief was pure, unadulterated, a raw and visceral thing that Arthur understood. It was Julian's grief, or lack thereof, that was the discordant note in this somber symphony. He hadn't been still for a moment, his restless energy a stark contrast to the heavy stillness of the room. He prowled the perimeter of the living room, his eyes scanning not with the sorrow of a man who had lost a beloved mother-in-law, but with the shrewd, calculating gaze of an auctioneer assessing the value of an estate. He paused before a small seascape, a piece Eleanor had purchased from a local artist, and murmured, "I wonder what this is worth." The words, though whispered, landed like a thrown stone in the still pool of Arthur's sorrow. The final, irrevocable crack in the fragile facade of their shared mourning appeared when Julian approached the mahogany bar, a magnificent testament to Arthur's love for Eleanor, a gift to celebrate their wedding. He ran his hand over the gleaming wood, a gesture that was less an appreciation of its craftsmanship and more a possessive claim. Then, with an air of casual entitlement that was breathtaking in its audacity, he unstopped the crystal decanter of Macallan, 18 the bottle. Arthur had been saving for an anniversary that would never come, and poured himself a generous measure. He didn't offer one to Arthur. He didn't even seem to register his presence. "She had great taste," Julian said, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Expensive taste. This property alone could set Lily and me up for life. Think of it, Art. No more worries." The words were a physical blow, knocking the air from Arthur's lungs. "Worries?" He managed, his voice a hoarse, ragged thing. "The only thing I'm worried about right now, Julian, is how empty this house feels without her." Julian, however, was impervious to the nuances of human emotion, his pragmatism a shield against the untidy messiness of grief. "Exactly," he said, his voice brisk and businesslike. "It's too big for one person. It's an asset, not a shrine." He placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to convey sympathy but felt more like the steadying hand of a predator on its prey. "Art, I know this is hard, but we need to be practical. This house is a gold mine. It's time to cash out. Let Eleanor's legacy work for us." In that moment, something shifted within Arthur. The numbing fog of grief began to recede, replaced by the cold, clear light of an architect's analytical mind. He looked at his son-in-law, at the carefully constructed mask of concern, and he saw the hairline fractures, the telltale signs of a flawed foundation. Julian's words were a wrecking ball wrapped in velvet, and Arthur, the master builder, could see the cheap materials hidden beneath the flashy facade. A flicker of movement outside the floor-to-ceiling windows drew his attention. His neighbor, Mrs. Gable, was tending to her roses, her face a mask of feigned indifference, but her eyes, filled with a ravenous curiosity, were fixed on their house. Arthur realized with a jolt that his private tragedy was, in fact, a public spectacle, and Julian was a performer playing to a captivated audience. Later, as Lily slept, her face still tear-streaked and pale, Arthur overheard Julian in the hall, his voice a low, urgent whisper into his phone. "Just give me a few more weeks," he hissed, the words sharp and brittle. "I've got a big fish on the line." The phrase, so cold and predatory, confirmed what Arthur had already begun to suspect. This wasn't just about avarice. It was about desperation. When Julian returned to the room, his face once again arranged into an expression of solicitous concern, Arthur met his gaze. "I need time, Julian," he said. The words a carefully constructed wall to buy him the space he needed to think, to plan. But as he looked at the man his daughter had married, at the proprietary way he looked at his sleeping wife, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. It was Eleanor, just days before she died, her voice weak but her eyes lucid. "Be careful, Art," she had whispered, her hand in his. "Men like him don't build, they just take." At the time, he had dismissed her words as the ramblings of a mind clouded by pain and medication. But now, in the chilling silence of his empty house, they echoed with the undeniable clarity of a prophecy. He looked at Julian, who was now staring out at the ocean, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips, and a cold, hard certainty settled in the pit of his stomach. This was far from over. This was a war, and the first battle had just been fought in the hallowed halls of his own home. He, Arthur, the architect, would meticulously uncover every structural flaw, every hidden weakness in Julian's carefully constructed life before it all came crashing down. He would do it for Eleanor. He would do it for Lily. He would do it because in the desolate landscape of his grief, a single, unwavering purpose had finally taken root. A month had passed. 4 weeks of a hollow, echoing existence where Arthur had begun the painstaking process of rebuilding. He wasn't rebuilding his life that felt like an architectural feat far beyond his current capabilities, but rather, he was reinforcing its foundations. He found a strange, quiet solace in Eleanor's rose garden, a sprawling tapestry of color and fragrance overlooking the endless blue of the Pacific. Tending to the roses had become his ritual, a communion with her spirit. Each snip of his pruning shears, cutting away the dead wood to encourage new growth, felt like an act of defiance against the decay that had claimed his wife and now threatened his home. The salt-laced air was filled with the perfume of Mr. Lincoln and peace roses, and in those moments, with the sun on his back and his hands in the soil, he felt a fragile, unnatural peace. The peace shattered with the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. It was a sound too aggressive for a friendly visit, too self-important for a delivery. Arthur straightened up, his back aching slightly, and watched as Julian's gleaming black Cadillac Escalade, a vehicle more suited for a rap mogul than a son-in-law, pulled to a stop. But Julian did not get out alone. 2 other men emerged, one from the passenger side, one from the back. They were large men, poured into suits that were a size too small and a decade out of style. They weren't overtly menacing, not in the way of movie thugs, but they carried an aura of impatient gravity, their thick necks and folded arms a silent, brutish form of punctuation to Julian's presence. They walked through the gate and onto the lawn, their expensive dress shoes sinking slightly into the soft grass, 3 dark figures silhouetted against the vibrant chaos of the garden. Julian led the charge, a smug, predatory smile fixed on his face. The mask of the caring son-in-law had been discarded, left behind like a cheap costume. "Time's up, old man," Julian announced, his voice carrying an oily confidence that slid over the garden's tranquility. "We tried being nice. Now, you're going to sign the listing agreement, and you're going to do it today." Arthur felt a flicker of fear, a primal instinct, in the face of a physical threat. but it was quickly extinguished by a surge of cold, righteous anger. He tightened his grip on the smooth wooden handles of his pruning shears. "This is Eleanor's garden, Julian. Show some respect." Julian let out a short, derisive laugh. "Respect?" he scoffed, taking a step closer, his two companions mirroring the movement, a silent, coordinated advance. "Respect doesn't pay the bills. This garden, this house, it's just equity sitting here, dying on the vine." He gestured dismissively at a magnificent, blooming hybrid tea rose. "Just like these roses will be when we bulldoze this place for a modern build." The casual cruelty of the threat to obliterate this living monument to his wife was what solidified Arthur's resolve. The larger of the two men, the one with a faint scar bisecting his eyebrow, spoke for the first time, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "We've all invested a lot in Julian's next project, art. We wouldn't want to see any delays." The pause was deliberate, each unspoken possibility hanging in the air like a toxic spore. Out of the corner of his eye, Arthur saw Mrs. Gable across the hedge, frozen in the act of watering her petunias, her gaze fixed on the unfolding drama. Further down the street, a couple walking a golden retriever had slowed their pace, their curiosity piqued. Julian, in his arrogance, was making a spectacle. He was being sloppy. Instead of cowering, Arthur felt a strange, exhilarating sense of relief. The monster had lumbered out of the shadows and into the bright California sun, revealing every ugly, brutish feature. He turned his attention back to the rose bush in front of him, located a withered blossom, and with a steady hand, snipped it cleanly from the stem. The small, decisive action seemed to unnerve Julian more than any shouting match could have. It was an act of ownership, of utter disregard for their presence. He was still the master of this space. He looked Julian directly in the eye, his gaze as cold and hard as polished granite. "You'll have your answer soon," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. The promise hung in the air, ambiguous and unsettling. Julian searched his face for a sign of weakness but found none. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. With a frustrated huff, he gestured to his partners, and the three of them retreated, their silent intimidation campaign a failure. Arthur watched them climb back into the ostentatious car and speed away. He didn't feel afraid. He felt a calculated pleasure, the thrill of an architect who has just seen his opponent make a critical design flaw. Julian had overplayed his hand, revealing the shoddy materials of his character. Arthur stood for a long moment in the quiet of the garden, the scent of roses filling his lungs. Then he pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the contacts. It was time to call Howard, the family lawyer. The blueprints for Julian's downfall were becoming clearer with every mistake he made. The response from Julian was not a phone call or a polite email. It was an invasion. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, a week after the confrontation in the Rose Garden, in the form of 3 luxury SUVs pulling up to the curb. Julian didn't bother with the gate's intercom. He and a crowd of about 10 others, a mix of young, sharp-suited men and women, who radiated an aggressive, voracious ambition, simply walked through the unlocked gate as if they owned the place. And in Julian's mind, they already did. Arthur sat in his study, the one room that still felt entirely his, and listened. He was not surprised. Howard, his lawyer, had warned him this was coming. He heard the front door open without a knock, the burst of loud, confident laughter echoing off the marble floors of the foyer he had designed 4 decades ago. They swarmed into the great room, their voices a cacophony of entitlement. Total tear down, obviously. The foundation is solid, but the aesthetic is prehistoric. Imagine a glass wall here, straight out to the cliff. Infinity pool right where that sad little rose garden is. The ceilings, though, we can work with the ceilings. Only, the sounds were like surgical instruments carving into living flesh. The sharp, electronic beep of laser measuring tapes, the tap-tap-tapping on walls as they searched for load-bearing studs, the grating scrape of a chair being moved not with care, but with dismissive force. Then came the pop and hiss of beer bottles being opened. His beer, from his refrigerator. A moment later, a thumping, soulless electronic beat began to pulsate through the floorboards, a soundtrack for the desecration of his life's work. He closed his eyes, deliberately enduring it, letting every insult, every act of trespass, fuel the cold, hard flame that was now burning in his chest. He was no longer a grieving husband. He was an architect observing a demolition crew that had arrived a day too early, unaware that the building they'd come to destroy still had one final, fatal secret hidden in its master blueprint. He allowed his mind to drift back to the previous week, to the hushed, mahogany-paneled office of Howard Finch. Howard had been his and Eleanor's lawyer for 30 years, a man whose quiet demeanor belied a mind as sharp and unforgiving as a steel trap. He's right about one thing, art, Howard had said. His fingertips dimpled as he peered over his glasses. You did sign the papers. Arthur had felt a cold dread snake through him. I don't remember. You wouldn't. It was 3 years ago. Eleanor's chemo had just failed for the second time. You were barely sleeping. Julian and Lily came to you with a stack of documents from their new estate planner. A quitclaim deed, transferring the property into a revocable trust, with Lily as the sole beneficiary and Julian as a co-trustee. Why would I? Because they told you it was to protect the asset, to simplify the inheritance, to avoid probate taxes. Howard finished, his voice laced with contempt. They used your grief and your distraction against you. It was predatory, but it was, I'm afraid, legal. Arthur had felt the floor drop out from beneath him. He was a guest. He was a tenant in the house he had built with his own hands. But, Howard had said, leaning forward, a glint in his eye, they made one critical error. They underestimated Eleanor. He slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across the polished desk. Eleanor was always 3 steps ahead. Art, always. She knew Julian better than anyone. She saw this coming. A month after you signed those papers, she came to my office, alone. She left you everything you need. Oh, you. Now, listen to the cacophony in his living room. Arthur felt the weight of that envelope in his mind. It was time. He stood, straightened his sweater, and walked out of the study. The scene in the great room was worse than he had imagined. Julian was the king of this tawdry court, a can of craft beer in his hand, regaling his disciples with plans for the house. A young woman in a blazer was holding a tablet, showing a 3D rendering of a minimalist glass box where his home now stood. They all saw him emerge at the top of the grand, sweeping staircase, and the momentary hush fell over the room. The music still thumped, an obscene heartbeat. Julian's face split into a wide, arrogant grin. He turned to his audience. Ah, the man of the hour. Don't mind us. Art, just a preliminary walkthrough with the team. Arthur descended the stairs slowly, his hand on the smooth, worn oak of the banister that he and Eleanor had chosen together. He stopped at the bottom, his feet planted firmly on the floor he had laid. This is enough, Julian, he said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that cut through the noise. Get these people out of my house. The smile on Julian's face widened into a sneer of pure condescension. He turned back to his friends, a theatrical gesture of disbelief. Did you hear that? He asked the room at large. His house. That's cute. So cute. The group chuckled, a wave of sycophantic laughter. Then Julian turned back, his face just inches from Arthur's, the smell of beer and self-satisfaction radiating from him. The friendly mask was gone, replaced by the raw, ugly face of his greed. Listen to me, he hissed, his voice a low, vicious snarl. This house belongs to the future. It belongs to Lily, which means it belongs to me. Your name isn't on the deed anymore. We had it changed for estate planning years ago. Remember? You're living here on our goodwill. He jabbed a finger into Arthur's chest, a final public humiliation. Give you as the keys or we'll take them. You're just a guest here, old man. The words struck with the force of a physical blow. The insult, the cruelty, the absolute violation of it all. For a split second, a white-hot rage unlike anything Arthur had ever known threatened to consume him. His hands clenched into fists. He could feel the blood pounding in his ears. The room watched, breathless, expecting him to shout, to crumble, to lash out. And then, he did something utterly unexpected. He smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the cool, precise smile of an engineer who has found a fatal stress fracture in an opponent's design. It was a smile of absolute confidence, and they wiped the sneer clean off Julian's face, replacing it with a flicker of confusion and unease. Without another word, Arthur turned his back on Julian and the silent, watching crowd. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace back to his study. They heard the solid, satisfying thump of the heavy door closing. Then, a moment of silence, followed by the faint but distinct sound of a safe dial turning a series of quiet, deliberate clicks. A minute later, the study door opened again. Arthur emerged, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope. He walked back to Julian, who was still standing at the foot of the stairs. A look of wary uncertainty now etched on his face. Arthur's calm was more unnerving than any rage could have been. He stopped directly in front of his son-in-law and held out the envelope. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, his voice perfectly level. "It's my copy of Eleanor's final will and testament." Julian stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He took it hesitantly, his bravado evaporating under the weight of Arthur's unnerving calm. Arthur held his gaze, the engineer's smile returning, cold and sharp. The time bomb was set. The audience held its collective breath. The play was set for the final reveal. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow louder than all the noise that had come before. "Read page 5. The silence that followed Arthur's command was a living thing. It swallowed the thumping bass of the music, suffocated the lingering laughter, and pressed down on every person in the room. For a moment, Julian just stared, the thick cream envelope in his hand, an alien object. Then the spell broke. A loud, braying laugh erupted from his chest, a sound so forced it was almost a sob. "Oh, this is rich," he crowed, turning to his audience of would-be investors and acolytes, holding the will aloft like a prop. "The old man's losing it. He's giving me bedtime stories." He snatched the document from his envelope with a flourish, the paper crinkling in his fist. "Let's see what fairy tale Eleanor left for us, shall we?" His friends, relieved by his return to form, smirked and shuffled into a tighter semicircle, a jury ready to be entertained. The great room, the heart of Arthur and Eleanor's life together, had been transformed into a courtroom for a show trial, and Julian was a gleeful, mocking prosecutor. He cleared his throat theatrically and began to read aloud, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Article 4, Section 2, the Carmel Property Trust. Blah, 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 a lot of legal nonsense. Ah, here we go. He projected his voice, ensuring everyone could hear the punchline. The primary residence, located at 15 Ocean View Lane, Carmel by the Sea, California, shall be held in an irrevocable trust in my name, Eleanor Vance. He paused for effect, shrugging. "Okay, a trust. Smart. We knew that. Alphonse, he continued, but the sarcastic, booming cadence of his voice began to fray at the edges. A slight hesitation entered his reading. "My beloved husband, Arthur Vance, is granted lifelong tenancy." He squinted at the page, as if the words themselves were refusing to cooperate. His voice lowered, the performative energy draining away. "With the absolute right to live in and enjoy the property, undisturbed, for the remainder of his natural life." The room was quieter now. One of Julian's associates, a man in a tight-fitting gray suit, turned the music off completely. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic crash of waves on the rocks below. Julian swallowed the dry, clicking sound in the sudden stillness. He was no longer reading to the room. He was reading to himself, the words falling from his lips in a near whisper. His face, moments ago flushed with arrogant triumph, was beginning to pale. "Under no circumstances," he read, his voice barely audible, "may the property be sold, leveraged, or structurally altered in any way, while my husband is in residence." The words landed like stones. The young woman with the tablet, the one who had been so excited about an infinity pool, slowly lowered her device, her expression frozen in disbelief. The plan wasn't just delayed, it was impossible. "What?" One of the friends, the man in the gray suit, stepped forward, reading over Julian's shoulder. His face went slack with shock. "It can't say that. What about the board?" The trustees can change it, right? Who's on the board? All eyes were on Julian, who now looked like a man who had been punched in the gut. He scanned down the page, his finger tracing a line of elegant, damning text. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a strangled, cracking thing, the sound of a man's entire future crumbling to dust in his mouth. The trust's board of directors shall be comprised of Susan Gable. A collective, confused blink went through the group. The name was familiar. Arthur saw the exact moment the connection was made on the face of the woman with the tablet. Her eyes widened, flicking towards a window that overlooked the neighboring property. Mrs. Gable, the nosy, curtain-twitching neighbor. Julian's voice was broken now. Mary Ann Peters, Eleanor's best friend since their Stanford days. A woman who had openly despised Julian at every family gathering for the last decade. He took a ragged breath, a death rattle of his ambition. And Judge Catherine Riley. If the previous names were bullets, this one was a cannonball. Retired Superior Court Judge Catherine Riley, a woman known for her iron will, her razor-sharp legal mind, and her unshakable integrity. A woman who had been Eleanor's confidant for 40 years. A woman who could not be bought, bullied, or bamboozled. Dead silence. The Pacific Ocean seemed to roar into the vacuum. Julian's friends were no longer looking at him with admiration. They were looking at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They were investors who had just watched their investment evaporate. Their faces went pale, reflecting the utter ruin of the afternoon. Julian stood there, the will trembling in his hand, the paper a testament to his spectacular miscalculation. He had been so sure of his victory, so confident in the legal documents he had tricked a grieving man into signing. He had swaggered into this house to celebrate its demolition, only to find himself standing in the middle of a fortress designed by a brilliant, loving woman to protect its most precious treasure. Arthur hadn't moved. He hadn't said a word. He stood at the foot of the stairs, a silent guardian watching the verdict being delivered. He didn't need to speak. Eleanor, even in death, had spoken for him. Julian hadn't just lost the house. He had been publicly, profoundly, and perfectly outwitted. He had been architecturally, brilliantly, and completely dismantled by a woman whose love for her husband was a structure he had mistaken for ruin. For a long, suspended moment, the only sound in the magnificent room was the soft rustle of the will in Julian's trembling hand. The air, once filled with the swagger of imminent conquest, had become thick and unbreathable, crackling with the static of evaporating capital. The faces of Julian's entourage were a gallery of barely concealed panic. They were not friends mourning a compatriot's loss. They were sharks who had just watched the water drain from the bay. It was the man in the tight gray suit who broke the spell. He cleared his throat, a sound like gravel being ground under a heel, and took a half step back from Julian, a physical act of disassociation. "Julian," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier camaraderie, I think we should go. This is clearly a family matter." That was the signal. The dam of their false allegiance broke. A nervous chorus of hasty goodbyes filled the room. "I have a conference call. My wife's expecting me. We'll touch base later, Julian. Maybe." They didn't just walk away. They fled, a disorderly retreat from a deal that had turned radioactive. They scurried out the door he had thrown open with such arrogance, their footsteps a frantic, syncopated rhythm of abandonment. Within a minute, Julian was alone, left standing in the center of the room with Arthur, the sole witness to his spectacular implosion. The retreat of his followers seemed to funnel all the free-floating humiliation and rage directly into Julian. His face contorted, turning a blotchy, alarming shade of red. His chest heaved. He was a cornered animal, robbed of his prize and stripped of his pack. "You think you've won?" he screamed, the words tearing from his throat, raw and uncontrolled. "You and that dead witch, you've ruined me. I have investors, I made promises." His wild eyes scanned the room, searching for something to destroy, something to inflict a fraction of the pain he felt. They landed on a large ceramic vase on a side table near the window. It was a beautiful piece, a swirl of turquoise and sea green. One Eleanor had bought on their trip to Italy for their 25th anniversary. With a guttural roar of pure, impotent fury, Julian swung his arm, sweeping the vase from the table. It arced through the air for a split second before crashing onto the hardwood floor, exploding into 100 glittering shards. "If I can't have it, no one can!" He shrieked at the glittering ruin. The sound of the crash was still echoing when a calm, female voice cut through the tension. "Everything okay in here, Arthur?" I heard a crash. Both men turned. Standing in the open doorway was Mrs. Gable. She wasn't holding a watering can. She was holding her iPhone, its camera lens pointing directly at them, the small red light in the corner of the screen glowing steadily. She hadn't come as a nosy neighbor. She had come in her official capacity. Shortly after Julian's invasion had begun, Arthur had made a brief call, not to the police, but to a fellow board member, informing her of a potential incident that could affect the assets of the trust. Mrs. Gable's presence, calm, official, and recording, was a final nail in the coffin of Julian's rage. He froze, the fury on his face collapsing into a mask of stunned horror. He was on film, screaming, surrounded by the evidence of his vandalism. Arthur looked from Julian's pathetic, crumbling face to the shattered remains of his wife's favorite vase. He felt no sting of loss for the object, only a profound, crystalline clarity. He looked back at his son-in-law, his voice utterly devoid of heat or malice. It was the voice of an architect delivering a final, dispassionate structural analysis. "No, Julian," he said quietly. "We didn't ruin you. You were already ruined. You just didn't know it yet." He gestured with his chin toward the broken pottery on the floor. A structure built on greed is designed to collapse. There was nothing left for Julian to say. Every threat was hollow, every move documented. Trapped in the unwavering gaze of Arthur's judgment and the unblinking eye of Mrs. Gable's phone, he deflated. The last of his bluster seeped out of him, leaving behind the small, weak, and self-destructive man he had always been. Without another word, he turned and walked past Mrs. Gable, a humiliated, shuffling exit into the afternoon sun. Peace returned to the house. It settled like a fine dust, quieting the echoes of the chaos. After a moment, Mrs. Gable lowered her phone. "I have everything I need, Arthur. The other board members will be notified." She gave him a small, sad smile and quietly pulled the door closed, leaving him alone. Arthur stood in the vast, silent room for a long time. Then he walked over to the wreckage of the vase and knelt down, his old knees cracking a protest. He picked up a single palm-sized piece, its turquoise glaze still vibrant and beautiful. He felt no anger, no sadness for the broken thing. He felt only a deep, resonant peace. Lily would have to face the fallout of the man she had chosen, a mess of her own making. But here, in this house built of love and fortified by foresight, the battle was over. Eleanor had protected him. Her legacy, their legacy, was safe. The victory was not in the destruction of his enemy, but in the quiet, unshakable preservation of what he loved. The drive to Howard Finch's office in Monterey was a journey through a fog, both literal and emotional. A thick marine layer clung to the coast, muffling the world in a blanket of gray, a perfect mirror for the anxious uncertainty that clouded Arthur's mind. He had told Julian he would have an answer, but as he walked into the hushed, leather and mahogany sanctuary of Howard's law firm, he felt less like a man with a plan and more like a client preparing to hear the full extent of the damages. Howard, a man whose calm demeanor had navigated them through decades of contracts and investments, greeted him not with condolences, but with a firm, purposeful handshake. He gestured for Arthur to sit, and on the vast, polished expanse of his desk, between them, lay two thick, legally bound documents. "Thank you for coming in, Art," Howard began, his voice its usual placid baritone. "You were right to call. I've been waiting for this." He slid the thinner of the two documents across the desk. It was a crisp, modern-looking portfolio. "This," he said, his voice flat, "is the document Julian and Lily had you sign 3 years ago. The one establishing the revocable trust, naming Lily as the primary beneficiary and Julian as the co-trustee with power of attorney. The quitclaim deed you signed is in here as well." Arthur stared at the pages. The clean, laser-printed text, a sterile testament to his own folly. He remembered the moment, vaguely a blur of exhaustion and worry. Eleanor had been so sick, and he had been so focused on her comfort, that when Lily and Julian had presented the papers, speaking of simplifying things and protecting the estate for the future, he had signed without a second thought. So, it's true, Arthur said, his voice tense. He controls the house. It's Lily's, which means it's his. I was a fool. Howard offered a small, thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. You were a trusting father in an impossible situation. But Eleanor, he paused, tapping a long, manicured finger on the second, much thicker, older document, was a suspicious wife. She had been for years. He pushed the second document towards Arthur. It was bound in a classic dark blue, the title embossed in gold leaf, the Eleanor Vance Master Trust. Eleanor came to see me a month after you signed their papers. She'd been worried about Julian's business dealings for some time, ever since he married Lily. She saw the first cracks in his foundation long before anyone else. She knew he saw your home not as a legacy, but as a line of credit. Howard opened the master trust. Its pages danced with intricate clauses. The document Julian is waving around, it's a subsidiary trust. It's like a guest house that thinks it's the main estate. Eleanor's master trust, which predates theirs and is structured as an irrevocable entity, legally overrides it on all critical matters, specifically the sale, leverage, or architectural alteration of the property at 15 Ocean View Lane. Arthur leaned forward, his heart beginning to pound with a slow, powerful rhythm. What does that mean, exactly? It means, Howard said, a note of deep satisfaction entering his voice, that Julian's document gives him the keys to a car, but Eleanor's document keeps the engine. He can say he's the trustee of the property, but he has zero power to act on it without the consent of the Master Trust's board. And as you now know, that board is comprised of 3 people who would rather swim to Hawaii than give Julian a single dime. Also Van Dare a fond of a wave of emotion washed over Arthur, not just relief, but a profound, aching love for his wife. He could see her so clearly, sitting in this very chair, her body weakened by illness, but her mind as sharp and brilliant as ever. Planning, protecting, thinking 3 steps ahead. She was not just a loving wife. She was a brilliant strategist, a silent guardian who had anticipated every move of her opponent long before the game had even begun. There's more, Howard continued, turning a page. He was no longer just a lawyer. He was an interpreter, guiding Arthur through the labyrinths his wife had built. Eleanor's design is intricate. The master trust is tied to a significant portion of your shared stock portfolio. The dividends from those stocks are what pay the property taxes and upkeep on the house, all managed by the trust. It's a self-sustaining ecosystem. He pointed to another clause. And here is the most elegant part. This is a poison pill. Should anyone, specifically Julian or a party acting on his behalf, initiate legal action to contest the terms of the master trust, it triggers an automatic asset freeze on a separate account, an account from which Lily receives a substantial quarterly allowance left to her by her grandparents. Arthur stared, speechless. If Julian sues to get the house, Howard explained, Lily's income stops instantly. He would have to explain to his wife why her own inheritance is being held hostage by his greed. Eleanor knew Julian would never risk his access to Lily's money. She tied his hands with the one thing he worships more than property. The sheer, breathtaking genius of it left Arthur lightheaded. This wasn't just a defense. It was a perfectly calibrated trap, a series of interlocking legal mechanisms designed to make any aggressive move by Julian self-destructive. Arthur finally found his voice. So what do I do now? Do I send him a copy of this? Howard leaned back in his chair, a masterful strategist advising his field general. Absolutely not, he said. You do nothing. You let him walk deeper into the maze, Art. He's already threatened you in the garden. Let him escalate. Let him expose himself in front of witnesses. His arrogance is your greatest asset. The more rope you give him, the more spectacularly he'll hand himself. Go home, wait for his next move, and when it comes, call Mrs. Gable. Inform your board. Walking out of the law office, Arthur felt the coastal fog on his face, but the fog in his mind had lifted. The world was sharp, clear, and defined. He was not a victim waiting for the next blow. He was the custodian of a masterpiece of strategic design. He didn't just have a shield, he held an entire arsenal, forged by the fierce, protective love of his wife. Eleanor hadn't just built a wall, she had designed a labyrinth. And Julian, brimming with confidence and greed, was about to take his first confident step inside. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe, even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you? And where are you listening? The silence in the house was no longer a hollow, grief-stricken thing. In the weeks following the confrontation in the rose garden, Arthur had reshaped it. It was now a strategic silence, a patient and watchful quietude. He sat in his worn leather armchair in the great room, the afternoon sun slanting through the floor to ceiling windows, a hefty biography of Frank Lloyd Wright resting open in his lap. He wasn't reading. He was listening. He was waiting. Howard's counsel had become his mantra. Let him walk deeper into the maze. Let him expose himself. He didn't have to wait long. The sound was not a knock or the chime of the doorbell. It was the distinct, metallic click of a key turning in the lock. A key Lily still possessed. A key Julian now treated as his own. The heavy oak door swung inward, not with the hesitation of a guest, but with the entitled force of an owner. Julian strode in, a king returning to a newly conquered castle, and behind him, his court followed a troop of about 10 people. There were few sharp-suited, middle-aged men who radiated the impatient aura of money, their eyes darting around, calculating square footage and ocean views. But the one who caught Arthur's attention was a young man at Julian's side. He couldn't have been more than 30, dressed in a severe black turtleneck and architectural glasses, holding a tablet like a scepter. He was the high priest of this new religion of minimalist boxes and maximum profit. They poured into the foyer and fanned out into the great room. A wave of noise, expensive cologne, and restless energy. They carried laser rangefinders that shot out startling red dots, their electronic beeps, a vulgar punctuation in the serene space. Arthur did not look up from his book. He deliberately, and with a steady hand, turned a page. This was the first move in his own strategic design, to become a fixture, a part of the landscape they were so eager to desecrate, to be underestimated. Their voices, a cacophony of overlapping ambition, washed over him. The sightlines are incredible, but the flow is all wrong. It's compartmentalized. That entire wall has to go, the young architect declared, his voice cutting through the chatter with the arrogance of youth. He gestured toward the wall separating the living area from the formal dining room, a wall Arthur had designed to create distinct, intimate spaces. We'll open it all up, steel beams for support, create a seamless indoor-outdoor flow. The current design is dated. Dated. The word, so casually dismissive, was a small, sharp sting. That wall held a memory of 100 family dinners, of Christmases and birthdays, of Eleanor laughing, her face illuminated by candlelight. To this boy, it was just obstruction. Julian, basking in the role of visionary developer, clapped the young architect on the shoulder. Exactly, Leo. Blow it all out. We want light. We want air. We want a space that screams money. Aber, one of the investors, a man with a perpetually skeptical expression and a gold watch that glinted aggressively, gestured with his chin towards Arthur's silent form in the corner. Is he always this quiet? He murmured to Julian, his voice a low conspiratorial rumble. It's a bit creepy. Julian let out a booming laugh, a performance for the whole room. Don't mind Art, he said, his voice loud enough for Arthur to hear every condescending syllable. He's in mourning. For the past, we're here to bring in the future. He then leaned in closer to the investor, dropping his voice to a stage whisper that was just as performative. He's just part of the inventory we have to clear out. Arthur felt the insult land, but it was blunted by the cold armor of his purpose. The pain was real, a deep visceral ache for the legacy they were verbally shredding, but it was a distant thing. He was an observer now, a collector of evidence. He felt a flicker of pity for them, for their utter blindness. They saw wood and stone and glass, They were deaf to the history and the love that held the entire structure together. The procession continued, a destructive tour of his life's work. They moved to the massive stone fireplace, the heart of the home, each stone hand-selected by Arthur from a local quarry. "This is a monstrosity," Leo the architect announced, tapping a dismissive finger on the cool gray stone. "It's so heavy. So Northern Californian. We'll replace it with something clean, minimalist, a ribbon fireplace, Italian marble, perhaps, Calcutta gold." Each word was a chisel, chipping away at his memories. He remembered warming his hands by that fire on foggy mornings, Eleanor curled up on the sofa beside him. He remembered a young Lily toasting marshmallows, her face glowing with delight. And this boy, who had designed nothing more significant than a high-end dentist's office in Palo Alto, was calling it a monstrosity. Arthur's gaze drifted from their gesticulating forms to a small, unassuming white box high on the wall near the ceiling, disguised as a new model smoke detector. A tiny red light, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, blinked with reassuring regularity. Howard's idea, every word, every arrogant pronouncement, every contemptuous dismissal was being recorded. He remembered Howard's advice clearly. Don't call the police for trespassing. That's a misdemeanor. What you're gathering now is evidence of coercive intent, of harassment, of bad faith. It's a far more powerful weapon. He was not a helpless old man. He was the curator of their downfall. The group began to migrate towards the staircase, their voices already planning the demolition of the second floor. Arthur remained perfectly still, a silent anchor in the swirling tide of their greed. He was waiting. He had endured the insults to his work and the humiliation of being treated as an inconvenient piece of furniture. He was waiting for the one move that would cross the final line, the act that would be so egregious, so profoundly disrespectful, that it would provide the perfect, irrefutable climax to their performance. He was letting the pressure build in the faulty structure Julian called a plan. He knew that all flawed constructions eventually collapse under their own weight. He closed his book, the soft thud of the cover a quiet, final sound. The overture was over. The final act was about to begin. The tour of destruction had completed its circuit. Julian and his coterie of circling vultures drifted back into the great room, their voices a low hum of numbers and profit margins. They had measured, they had photographed, they had mentally sledgehammered every wall that held a memory for Arthur. Leo, the young architect, was swiping through renderings on his tablet, showing the investors a future of glass, steel, and stark, soulless white. The house that had been a warm, living entity for 40 years was now, in their minds, just a set of data points, an underperforming asset on a spreadsheet. Arthur had not moved. He remained in his armchair, the biography of a true architect resting in his lap, a silent, damning contrast to the pretender holding court in the center of his living room. He had listened to every word, absorbed every insult, cataloged every violation. He was a structure designed to withstand a seismic event, and the ground had been shaking for over an hour. Now, the final tremor was approaching. Julian, puffed up with the success of his presentation and the fawning deference of his investors, decided it was time for the grand finale. He needed to demonstrate, in a final, irrefutable way, his absolute dominion over this space. He strode directly toward Arthur, his expensive Italian loafers making no sound on the thick Persian rug. His shadow fell over the pages of Arthur's book. With a swift, dismissive motion, Julian reached down, slapped the heavy book shut, and tossed it onto the side table with a careless thud. The sound was a small, sharp crack in the vast, tense room. He held out his hand, palm up. The gesture was imperious, demanding. "The keys. Art," he said, his voice smooth and final. "The front door, the back door, the garage door opener. My architect needs full access to the property. We'll be starting the detailed survey next week." This was it, the moment Arthur had been waiting for, the point of no return. Slowly, deliberately, Arthur placed his hands on the arms of the chair and pushed himself to his feet. He was an old man. His movements were not as fluid as they once were, but he rose with an unshakable dignity that seemed to make him taller, more solid. For the first time since they had invaded his home, he met Julian's gaze directly, and his voice, when he spoke, was as cold and clear as ice. "This is my home, Julian," he said, the words perfectly spaced, each one a polished stone of truth. "These people are trespassing, and so are you." A few of the investors shifted uncomfortably. The quiet, creepy old man in the corner had a voice, and it was not the voice of a victim. Julian, however, was too far gone in his delusion of power to register the warning. He let out a great, booming laugh, a fake, hollow sound meant for his audience. "Oh, listen to him," he exclaimed, turning to the group. "Still playing the king in a castle he no longer owns. It's almost sad." He turned back to Arthur, his smile vanishing as he stepped closer, invading Arthur's personal space until their faces were only inches apart. The smell of his cologne was cloying, suffocating. "Let me make this simple for you, so even you can understand," he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Legally, this is Lily's. And Lily and I were a team. What's hers is mine. That's how marriage works, Art. Which means I own this place." He paused, letting the disgusting logic hang in the air between them. Now, the keys. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply held his ground, his silent defiance a more potent challenge than any shout could ever be. And Julian, finally, broke. The frustration of being defied by this old man, in front of his audience, in the moment of his ultimate triumph, was too much. The carefully constructed mask of the savvy businessman dissolved, revealing the screaming, entitled child beneath. His voice rose to a full-throated, vein-popping roar that echoed through the high-ceiling room. "Give US the keys, or we'll take them. You're just a guest here, old man." The words, brutal and absolute, slammed into the stunned silence of the room. They were a punch to the soul. Even Julian's sycophants looked shocked, their nervous smiles frozen on their faces. They were here for a ruthless business deal, not a patricidal bloodsport. The raw, ugly cruelty of the statement had made them all complicit in something sordid, and they didn't like it. In that deafening silence that followed the scream, every eye was on Arthur, waiting for him to shatter, to rage, to weep. Instead, he smiled. It was the most terrifying thing any of them had ever seen. It was not a smile of mirth or forgiveness. It was a slow, quiet, mysterious smile that didn't touch his eyes. His eyes were cold, calculating, and utterly, completely calm. It was the smile of a man who had not been insulted, but had just received the final, crucial piece of data he needed to complete a complex calculation. The smile completely unnerved Julian. It was a reaction that didn't compute, a response that wasn't in his playbook. He took a half step back, a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes for the first time. Arthur let the smile linger for a moment longer, enjoying the confusion it sowed. Then he spoke, his voice once again quiet, almost conversational. "You want the keys to Eleanor's house?" he said, as if considering a perfectly reasonable request. "You're right, I shouldn't have them." He paused, looking Julian directly in the eye. The owner should, and with that, he turned his back on Julian and the stunned, silent crowd. With a steady, unhurried gait, he walked toward the solid oak door of his study, leaving behind a room thick with confusion and a gathering sense of dread. Julian thought he had just won the war with a final, devastating cannon blast. He didn't realize he had just stepped on the trigger of a perfectly placed landmine. The study door opened with a soft, deliberate click that was louder in the tomb-like silence of the room than Julian's previous shouting. All eyes, which had been darting between Julian's blotchy, furious face and the floor, snapped towards Arthur. He stood in the doorway, a figure of placid calm. In his hand, he held a single, thick, cream-colored envelope. He walked forward, his steps measured and unhurried, not with the frail shuffle of an old man, but with the steady, grounded gait of a man walking on a foundation he had built himself. He stopped in front of Julian, who stared at the envelope as if it were a coiled snake. The air was thick with a new kind of tension, not the explosive energy of rage, but the heavy, humming anticipation of a verdict. Arthur extended the envelope. Julian seeing his audience watching, summoned a last ragged shred of his bravado. He snatched the document from Arthur's hand, a sneer twisting his lips. What's this? He scoffed, his voice a little too loud, a little too shrill. Your surrender terms? A little late for that old man, biased tans and the rest. He turned to his investors, who were now huddled together like nervous sheep, and held the envelope aloft. Let's see what final pathetic plea the old ghost has for us, he declared, putting on a show. He tore the envelope open with a flourish and pulled out the folded document within. He unfolded it with a dramatic crackle of paper. Let's see, the last will and testament of Eleanor Vance. How touching. He scanned the first few pages with theatrical impatience. Blah, blah, boilerplate, legal jargon. Here we are. He cleared his throat, projecting his voice, still the master of ceremonies in his own tragicomedy. He began to read aloud from the top of page 5, Article 4, Section 2, the Carmel Property Trust. His voice was loud, clear, and dripping with mockery. The primary residence, located at 15 Ocean View Lane, Carmel by the Sea, California, shall be held in an irrevocable trust in my name, Eleanor Vance. He paused, looking up with a dismissive smirk. A trust. We know about the trust, Art. It's Lily's trust, which means it's my trust. Old news. He glanced back at the page, and his confident, flowing recitation began to hitch. He blinked, rereading the next line silently before speaking it, the words coming out slower, the sarcastic edge beginning to dull. My beloved husband, Arthur Vance, is granted lifelong tenancy. He faltered, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. He looked up at Arthur, a question in his eyes, but found only serene, implacable calm. He looked back at the page, his voice dropping several registers, the performance for his friends forgotten. He was now reading for himself, for his own survival, with the absolute right to living and enjoy the property undisturbed for the remainder of his natural life. The word absolute hung in the air, a legal iron bar. Leo, the architect, imperceptibly lowered his tablet. One of the investors, a man who had made his fortune in real estate litigation, took a slow, deliberate step away from Julian's side. The panic had begun, a silent, spreading contagion. Julian's breathing was shallow now. Sweat began to bead on his temples, tracing a path down his suddenly pale skin. He read the next line in a choked whisper, a death sentence delivered in his own voice. Under no circumstances may the property be sold, leveraged, or structurally altered in any way, while my husband is in residence. A soft gasp came from the woman in the blazer. The entire premise of their gathering, the multi-million-dollar teardown and rebuild, the reason they were all standing in this room, had just been declared null and void. Julian's hands were shaking now, the paper trembling. The litigator who had stepped away spoke, his voice cold and clinical. Who are the trustees, Julian? Read the board of directors. Julian's eyes scanned frantically down the page, searching for a loophole, a name he could manipulate, a crack in the fortress that had just materialized around him. He found none. He read the names as if they were poison on his tongue. Any and all decisions regarding the future of the trust shall be made by a majority vote of the trust's board. Susan Gable. The name landed with the force of a physical blow. Several of them glanced instinctively towards the window, towards the neighboring house, as if expecting to see the nosy neighbor in question, now revealed as their project's executioner. Julian's voice was now a ragged, strangled whisper. Mary Ann Peters. He looked up, his eyes wild with disbelief. Mary Ann, Eleanor's fiercely loyal best friend, a woman who looked at Julian as if he were something she'd scraped off her shoe. He took a shuddering breath, his gaze falling to the final name on the list, the one that sealed his fate beyond all appeal. He read it in a voice of utter defeat, and Judge Catherine Riley, the name, the title, was a cannon shot that blew the last remnants of Julian's plan to dust. A retired Superior Court judge, unimpeachable, unmovable, unbeatable. The silence that descended was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Julian's friends stared at him, their faces a mixture of horror, disgust, and cold, financial fury. They had been led into a humiliating, unwinnable war by a fool. Not only was the deal dead, but they had all been made party to the harassment of a man protected by one of the most respected legal minds in the state. Julian stood mute, the paper slipping from his numb fingers and drifting to the floor. He looked at Arthur, his face a mask of utter devastation. He had been so close. He had won. He had triumphed. He had stood on the corpse of the past and declared himself the future. And a woman, already in her grave, had reached out and pulled the entire edifice down on top of him. He hadn't just been beaten. He had been made to announce his own utter and complete annihilation in front of the very people he had sought to impress. Arthur, who had not moved, who had not spoken a word, finally broke the silence. He looked at Julian, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a profound, weary finality. "The house is not for sale, Julian," he said, his voice calm and steady. It never was. He took a step forward, his gaze sweeping over the pale, shocked faces of the investors before landing back on his son-in-law. "You are never the host. You are always a guest, and your visit is over. I bet 99% of you will hear this, sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe, even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening?" The seconds after Julian finished reading stretched into an eternity. The will lay on the floor between them, a pale rectangle of ink and paper that had detonated their lives. The investors, men who navigated the world through a lens of risk and reward, were the first to process the new reality. This wasn't a temporary setback. This was a total, catastrophic loss. The asset was untouchable, locked away in a legal fortress designed by a master, and they had just been filmed as accomplices in a campaign of intimidation against its rightful, lifelong tenant. The litigator, the man who had been the first to sense the shifting currents, was the first to act. He smoothed the front of his already immaculate suit jacket, a gesture of brisk, professional detachment. "Julian," he said, his voice a cold, flat thing, utterly devoid of its earlier warmth. "This has been illuminating. I have a prior engagement I need to attend to. My office will be in touch regarding our preliminary investment." The final four words were a clear and present threat. That was the signal. The herd, sensing a predator, bolted. "My God, is that the time?" Another investor sputtered, glancing at his gleaming Rolex as if it had just screamed at him. "I have a flight to catch. A sudden flight. I think we should go," the young woman with the tablet said, her face pale. She wouldn't meet Julian's eyes. They scurried out, a reverse parade of the confident procession that had entered just an hour before. They offered no handshakes, no commiserations. They simply abandoned him, leaving him standing alone in the center of the room, the sole inhabitant of his own ruin. Julian watched them go, his face a canvas of disbelief morphing into pure, unadulterated rage. He was a king whose subjects had not only deserted him but had also stolen the castle walls on their way out. His gaze, wild and desperate, darted around the room, searching for a target, for anything he could break that would make a sound as loud as the shattering of his own ego. His eyes landed on the turquoise and sea green ceramic vase on the side table, Eleanor's favorite from their trip to Italy. With a guttural roar that was more animal than human, he lunged. His arms swung in a vicious arc, and the vase flew, crashing against the hardwood floor and exploding into a starburst of glittering fragments. The sound was sharp, violent, and ultimately unsatisfying. "You've ruined me!" he screamed at Arthur, his voice cracking with the hysteria of a spoiled child. "You and that dead witch, you've ruined everything!" "Everything okay in here, Arthur?" The voice, calm and steady, came from the open doorway. Both men turned. It was Susan Gable. She stood on the threshold, not as a nosy neighbor, but as a composed officer of the court. In her hand, held steady at chest height, was her iPhone. The small red light in the corner of the screen glowed like a malevolent, all-seeing eye. She had arrived not by coincidence, but by summons. Arthur's brief call to her an hour earlier had been the final, strategic placement of the board. Julian froze, the scream dying in his throat. He saw the phone, saw the recording light, and understood. This was not just a defeat. This was a public execution. His impotent rage, his act of vandalism, his unhinged accusations, all of it. captured, documented, and witnessed by a member of the very board that held his fate in its hands. Arthur looked from Julian's pathetic, crumbling face to the scattered fragments of his wife's vase. He felt a pang, not of anger, but of a deep, weary sorrow for the man before him. A man so hollow he had to destroy beautiful things to feel alive. He looked back at Julian, his voice devoid of triumph, holding only the weight of an inescapable truth. "No, Julian," he said quietly. "We didn't ruin you. You were already ruined. You just didn't know it yet." His gaze drifted to the shards on the floor. A structure built on greed is designed to collapse. There was nothing left. No bluster, no threats, no audience to perform for. Trapped between Arthur's final, damning judgment and the unblinking lens of Susan Gable's phone, Julian simply broke. The rage, the arrogance, the ambition, it all drained out of him, leaving a hollowed-out shell of a man. He stared at Arthur for a long moment, his face a wasteland of shame and hatred, then turned and walked past Mrs. Gable without a word, a humiliating, shuffling exit into the afternoon light. The silence that returned was profound. After a moment, Mrs. Gable lowered her phone. "I have everything I need, Arthur. The board will be fully apprised." She gave him a look of deep empathy, then quietly pulled the door closed, leaving him in the sanctity of his home. He was alone. He stood for a long time, the afternoon sun warming the floor around him. He walked over to the wreckage and knelt, his knees protesting. He picked up a single large fragment of the vase, its turquoise glaze still brilliant, a beautiful piece of a broken whole. He went to his armchair, the shard cooling his hand, and sat. He took a deep breath. Then he took out his phone and dialed his daughter's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice anxious. "Dad? Julian just called me. He was screaming. What happened?" Arthur looked out the window at the vast, calming expanse of the Pacific Ocean. "It's over, honey," he said, his voice gentle. He would not punish her, not today. Life and Julian would do that for him. "When you're ready," he added, "a quiet, final condition, come home, alone." He ended the call and let his hand fall to his lap. He sat there for a long time, in the great room he had built, surrounded by the memories he had protected. The afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, just as it had on the day of the funeral. But the oppressive weight of grief was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding peace. The house was quiet, but it was not empty. He could feel her, Eleanor, her love, her foresight, her fierce, brilliant spirit. It was in the walls, in the light, in the enduring strength of the foundation. The circle was complete. Justice had been served, and her legacy was safe.